Now, all of a sudden, anything that's disputed in terms of the lease renewal also has to go to housing court. And if you want to raise the rent above whatever the threshold is, be it 3% or 5% or whatever they ultimately decide that they want to pass in this legislation, you have to go to court and prove that you need more than that. It's going to put even more burden on that system that is already terrible for it.
Welcome back to this week's episode of the Lady Landlords podcast. Today, we have a very special guest here. We have Tim Foley joining us from the Building and Realty Institute of Westchester in New York. He is the CEO and Executive Vice President, joining us here today to really talk about what it's like for landlords to really get involved in their community, policy, legislation. Tim, I appreciate your time.
Becky, thanks so much for inviting me on.
Yeah. So I would love if you would just start with just a simple introduction of who you are, just a little bit about the man behind BRI.
Sure, absolutely. So I started in BRI as only the third executive director in its 78-year history back in January of 2020. You may notice that some things happened a couple of months after I came onto the scene. We managed to adapt to all the changing circumstances of COVID. We managed to change a lot of our practices, and we've really been able to recalibrate what our organization does. My background prior to that was mostly working in local politics. So I worked for an assembly member here in Westchester County, where I live, and I'm currently working for a few years. And I spent a lot of time working for various labor unions, primarily in New York State, but also across the country.
How did that background within politics lead to the transition of real estate? Because most people don't seem to kind of connect those two things together. So I'm going to ask it in this way, but what qualified you from politics to move over into the real estate world?
Well, that is a fabulous question. And it was one that I was asking myself when I was applying for this job, because I was thinking to myself, like, you know how sometimes you're a little bit extra loose in the interview process where you're like, I'm not going to get this. Like, I don't know the first thing about real estate. I've dabbled in some of the issues, but really what my focus was on working in member-driven organizations. That's what a union is. That's also what a real estate trade association is. My job is really to help bring members together. For the BRI, we always say our core mission is about advocacy. So that's where some of my political background comes into being. It's about education and programming. And I've spent a lot of time educating people on things ranging from complex policy issues to things like best practices in a variety of different contexts. And so that was very translatable to the real estate sphere. And the last one is networking. And that's really about connecting people, helping you grow your business, helping you figure out, well, what type of contractors might I need in order to do my repairs? I'm looking for a better lawyer than the one that I have, who's out, that sort of thing. And so, although my background in real estate itself had been somewhat limited, my background in advocacy, education, and networking was pretty strong. And that's ultimately why I got the job.
Well, congratulations. And we are happy that you're over there running the ship.
Oh,
So tell me a little bit about what the Building and Realty Institute does. What is that?
yeah. So basically, as a real estate trade association, our members are organizations, businesses. In some cases, they're nonprofits. In some cases, they're cooperatives. We try and represent the broadest spectrum of real estate interests within Westchester County. So on the building side, we have home builders, multifamily developers, remodelers, commercial developers, and that constitutes the building. On the realty side, we have those who own or operate existing multifamily. So that's landlords, although we prefer to call them property owners. It sounds a little better these days. Property owners, co-op and condo boards are members of our association. Property managing agents are members of our association. And we have a whole host of other companies that just want to do business with all of the above. And that can include lawyers and engineers and bankers, but it can also include people who want to sell uniforms for building service employees or specialized subcontractors who work those big excavators. And they're not building anything themselves necessarily, but you need them to do a good job. And we pull everybody together as much as possible, as I said, for advocacy, education, and networking. And the advocacy is actually a really big piece of that, because one of the things that I learned coming out of the union world is you're either at the table or you're on the menu. And what the real value of an association of ours is we're pulling people who don't necessarily have very common backgrounds and might not even have similar businesses, but housing is our through line. And housing has become such a big political issue at the state level, certainly at the federal level, they're talking about it now, and absolutely at the local level. That bringing everybody together means that everybody has a much larger voice, and we're helping support each other in those issues.
Okay, a couple questions there come to mind. First, hearing you say all those things, many of our listeners are probably thinking, well, who's this backed by? And really, who is this supposed to be serving?
Mhm.
Right? Is this something that state, local government put together to then kind of bridge that gap between government and those actually working through society? Or was this really something that was more grassroots that those of us actually functioning and doing these jobs said, hey, we need to be able to come together to really have a voice in government?
100% grassroots right from the get go. We started off primarily with home builders way back in the 1940s and the 1950s. Well, over time, we grew as the industry grew. So some of those folks who were building homes or building multifamily in the 50s and the 60s all of a sudden decided, I don't know, I want to build anymore. Maybe I just manage the properties that I have. Then all of a sudden, we had landlords in our association. And then the landlords brought with them the property managers. And then the property managers said, hey, I have a bunch of these co-op and condo boards. They probably need some assistance, some technical support, some education. And also, all of a sudden, they're starting to get regulated in a way that they weren't before by government. So it really is
Right.
grassroots. It evolved organically over a number of decades. Our association did anyways. But again, at a certain point, we're representing not just our individual members, which we certainly do, and they help direct everything that we do from choosing the topics that we will put on for our programs to determining where we're going to prioritize in terms of our lobbying or in terms of the issues that we're acting on where. But at the end of the day, it's also on behalf of the industry as well and giving the industry a voice.
Right. Okay, thank you. I feel like a lot of people, we always kind of look for who benefits, right? Where is that really kind of coming from? So I really love the idea that this is an organization that those of us in the industry can really utilize for those connections, for those education, for those resources. But you mentioned in there having organizations that provide uniforms for the maintenance workers, right? Or excavation companies. Well, what is little old lady landlord who owns 1 to 2 units? I just have my tenants. I just collect my rent at the end of the month. Why is something like this important to me? I'm not involved in government or politics. I just want to be able to provide a home to somebody that needs it.
Well, the funny thing is that we have members who join for any number of different reasons. So there may be members who say, like, I don't really want to get involved in politics, but I really need to know, like, someone who's going to help fix my boiler when it breaks. And I don't like the guy that I have, and I'm looking for other people. Well, you come to one of our networking events, you come to one of our events, and you make those connections. And other folks may be saying, I'm kind of okay right now, but I have certain issues that I'm dealing with. I've got really problematic tenants. I'm not sure how to deal with them. I have a no smoking ban. I'm not sure how to implement that. My lawyer gave me some advice, but I'd really like to know what other people are doing. Well, then you come to one of our events and you hear from property owners like yourself, big, medium, small, about how they've been able to execute, what steps they took, what's been successful, what's not been successful. And after a period of time, you start to realize everybody's got the same problems, right? And everybody's looking for the same resources and everybody's trying to get ahead of the curve. So one of the programs, in fact, when I'm done talking with you, we're going to go talk about laws that don't exist in Westchester, but do exist in New Jersey or New York City, relating to greenhouse gases or reserve study in multifamily buildings, because getting ahead of the curve is sometimes half the battle. Figuring out what I'm going to be required to do when I can do it cheaply, when I can do it efficiently, when I can take my time with it is sometimes the key to success, as opposed to like all of a sudden this big mandate came down, I have 6 months to do it, and I have no idea where to start. So that's also a benefit that a lot of members get from our organization, the information that helps them do their business better.
Or one of the things also in there that I notice is also sometimes new laws that now impact us that small time landlord doesn't even hear about or know. And then all of a sudden now we are out of compliance, but we didn't even realize that. That was something that I had realized back in New York, being an owner there of most of my properties in June 2019. There were a lot of changes in New York State. And fortunately, that was when I started to join a lot of networking groups. That was actually, I think, the first time that I attended a BRI meeting. And it was just so great to get that information up front to make sure that I really was being compliant, that I was not putting myself in trouble, things that were then going to cost me, small time landlord here, money, time, create problems with my tenants, with my landlording business that were really going to cause larger problems moving forward in the future. So thank you for answering those questions. I'm clearly been coy with that as a person that has clearly attended BRI meetings, but also as a board member. I think this organization is something so important. I think as landlords, we need to get involved in our local organizations to understand not only what now has been passed down and enacted, but also what is kind of coming down the pipeline. So,
That's exactly right. And the other thing that we always say is that, you know, again, whether you like your local elected officials or don't happen to like them, partisan politics entirely aside, they don't know what you do. And that's not a knock against them, right? So if you're an elected official, and particularly if you're up in the state capitol, one day you're voting on a farm bill, and one day you're voting on a bill that has to do with healthcare, and one day you're voting on something that has to do with education and real estate. They can't be experts in everything. You hope their staff is pretty good, but they can't be. I mean, they have to be generalists. They have to know a little bit about everything. So having regular conversations with your elected officials to talk about what you're dealing with as a landlord, as a property owner, to talk about issues in a very specific way, that's indispensable in terms of helping them understand both the ramifications of the policies that they may be contemplating passing, but also to understand how they can support you and support your business.
I'm happy to hear you say that because we tend to take that for granted. Others either don't necessarily care exactly what we do, or really they just don't understand kind of the ins and outs in that. I think we saw so many landlords, I think, saw that during the eviction moratorium, which during the pandemic was absolutely needed. There were a lot of people that were out of work, a lot of financial constraints. There were so many people that were sick. There were so many things that were actually happening at that point in time that I completely understand why that was happening. But there absolutely needed to be a dialogue then of, well, what support does then the landlord need? Right? Absolutely understandable why there was support for tenants. That was absolutely needed during the pandemic. But then there also needed to be further conversation of, well, now what support do landlords need also in those situations? And that's something that unless we have those conversations, it just really is not necessarily understood.
Well, I was just going to say, and there's a perfect example for that. In multiple states, including here in New York, they passed something called the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which was designed for tenants who suffered a financial difficulty because of COVID and fell behind in rent to apply for state and federal funding that would go directly to the landlord to pay for those rent arrears. But one of the things that they missed is that sometimes you had a tenant who skipped out in the middle of the night and you have no way of reaching them. And there's money here to pay for their arrears, but there's no way to actually find the tenant. In other cases, the landlord made a lot of good faith efforts to try and track somebody down, to try and get them to apply. The tenant had to be involved in applying. And at some point, the tenant's like, I just don't want to do this, or they just didn't respond at all. So one of the things that we nudged that they did pass in New York, based on the intervention of our property owners and others around the state, is they then created a separate landlord fund where you could show in good faith, try to reach this person, have no forwarding address, have no way of reaching them, and then you could get some of the rental arrears to cover it for COVID through that program. That wouldn't have happened if landlords weren't reaching out to their elected officials. They weren't saying, yes, this program for emergency rental assistance is really good. Thank you. But here's this other set of circumstances that's not going to cover. Can we do something for that? That's not something that elected leaders would have come up with on their own.
Right. That seems so fantastic and shiny to put onto your resume to say, hey, we were able to provide this rental assistance. Tenants, there you go, just apply and then make sure that you're not in arrears with your landlord. But you're right. If that's not something that that tenant took that action on, that still has that impact on us as landlords. And that was just a gap that was missed. I think that was absolutely fantastic to have that landlord fund, which really closed that gap and allowed us to advocate for ourselves and say, wait,
Yeah.
we did all the things that we were supposed to, but yet we're the ones that are still impacted by this. So I think that was absolutely fantastic. I'm very fortunate since I am in Westchester County and that's where BRI is, and so many other fantastic organizations. But we have a lot of listeners in other places outside New York. How do we even come across finding a group like this? If I'm in another state, another city, and would like to learn and join a community like this, how can I go about even finding something?
So it is a little bit tricky depending on where you are in the country. There is a national organization called the National Association of Apartment Owners, and they will often have local or state affiliates. We are not one of them, so you wouldn't have found us that way. But there are affiliates of theirs that do exist within New York City. And again, they provide relatively good resources just from a national or federal perspective. They may not necessarily have something that is specific to your locality or to your state, but it's a pretty good place to start. And again, sometimes it's just about creating that network. A lot of the problems are the same no matter where you are. The legislation might be different, but the issues are very much the same. The other thing that you can try and do is look out for your local chamber of commerce, your local business council, so on and so forth. They may often have a property owner or a real estate group within them. So in fact, a couple of the chambers of commerce here in Westchester County do have real estate task forces. I happen to serve on those. So we're all interconnected, and that makes it a pretty easy way to create a network where you can sort of go find people who are experiencing the same problems you're experiencing.
That was actually my experience. That was how I found BRI. When I first moved to Westchester County, I started to go to the police precinct meetings, the quality of life meetings. I went to our city council meetings. And then from people from there, then I found out about an owners association meeting within our city. Then from the people that I had met there, they said, well, you should be going to these meetings, you should be going to those. And it was really just a chain of events of that networking. And we all kind of find our home and our group of people and really what's a good fit for us. But it's really important to start to get involved and start asking questions of what other meetings, where else can I get involved? This might have to be something that now I take on as a project of also throwing together on our website a lot of different groups. And maybe that's something that our community as Lady Landlord can do, making sure to share those resources. All right, now that's something that I'm gonna have to add that to my to-do list. But I think that's really important as owners, as business owners. It's really important to understand what's going on in our community and what's going on in our states and what's going on legislatively. What would you say is one of the biggest topics in New York right now that you are dealing with through BRI?
Well, so there has been a raging housing debate within New York for the last few legislative sessions. The simple fact is, within our region, we're experiencing an acute housing shortage, and it really affects everything across the board. We're unfortunate enough that Westchester County actually put in the time and the investment to study this and has really hard data. And what they found back in 2019, right before I started, was that we were short about 11,703 units of housing. That meant that we had that many people in the county who were actively looking for somewhere to live and couldn't find anything or couldn't find anything within their price range. And that's new construction. That's not even counting housing that might be substandard or overcrowded or so on and so forth. This is an issue that is a huge through line between everything that we do because it affects our builders, obviously, who are trying to build homes. It affects those who own or operate existing multifamily as well, because when you're in a shortage, really crazy things start to happen. Things get very, very expensive. They start to blame the owners. Sometimes it's within the owner's control. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just basic economics. And then there are going to be a lot of good solutions. There are going to be a lot of bad solutions. The most important solution is, of course, to start building. And that we have a whole campaign called the Welcome Home Westchester campaign, where we work with our allies to try and talk about the real need to get serious about housing in a way that we haven't done before. But some of it is also when you're trying to navigate these very choppy waters of a housing shortage, how do you make sure you're not passing policies or laws that look good on the face of them, but would actually make things much, much worse? And that's one of the things that we're heavily involved
And that sounds like what you were kind of mentioning earlier was just some of the policies that are brought to the table, or sometimes people that just don't necessarily understand the day-to-day operations within landlording, within rental properties, within that space,
in. Well, and
right?
I also think there's, again, a natural tension between tenant advocacy organizations and landlord organizations because there's a natural tension between them. The same is true for like labor unions and employers. tensions are okay, right? You can live within a tension, you can navigate it. It's not necessarily a problem to be solved. But when you're dealing with a housing shortage and people are feeling insecure in their finances, both landlords and tenants are feeling pretty insecure in their finances at the current moment, then things can get really fractious in a way that's unproductive, and not very helpful. People often use the phrase housing crisis. It doesn't really tell you that much. Are we talking about existing housing? Are we talking new housing? What's actually the crisis and what's causing it? And particularly, I don't like that phrase because when you're in crisis mode, sometimes people panic, and that can lead to very bad things.
Right. And I feel like that's something we're seeing often right now, kind of from a very reactionary standpoint. And once again, there are, I would imagine, more tenants in the space, especially in New York, than there necessarily are landlords. And I feel like that's more of a buzzword. Those are things that you're going to hear more about than you're going to necessarily see, once again, more of the landlord or property owner advocacy or organizations out there speaking. So one topic that I just noticed is a very big buzzword that keeps coming around. And every time that I kind of hear, okay, this is quiet, we're moving on from this. This is not going to be a problem that we're going to need to address anymore. It pops back up.
Comes right
That
back.
is that is good cause eviction. Tip, can you briefly explain what is good cause eviction? That sounds like such an odd phrase. Can you just break that down for our listeners, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And for your listeners who are in New York, you've heard this all the time, constantly since 2019, because it's been at the center of every big housing debate in Albany. And we've had some real, real tough fights. Outside of New York, you're starting to hear some of it too. So it exists in New Jersey. It got passed there way in the 1970s. It got passed more recently in 2019 in California. I think Oregon has something similar to it. And we've been fighting about it in New York. It actually even made its way into some of the presidential campaign policy papers back in 2020 for some of the candidates who didn't make it. But here's basically the general gist of it. It changes fundamentally a lot of the terms of the landlord-tenant relationship. So here in New York, we already have rent stabilization in a number of different municipalities. Those are buildings that are built before 1974. They meet certain characteristics. And so they have certain protections for the tenants, been in place since the 70s, and their rent can only go up a certain percentage each year. But here in Westchester, we have about 25,000 rent stabilized units, and we have, 1 million people. So most people aren't in rent stabilization. Good cause eviction is trying to bring those types of tenant protections to everybody. There are 4 big components to it. The first component to it is sort of in the name. You could only evict somebody for certain reasons. One of them is failure to pay rent. Some of them is obviously violating the terms of the lease, doing damage to the apartment, doing illegal activities, so on and so forth. And although there's a lot of focus on that, that part's not much of a big change. You kind of need a reason to go to housing court in the first place. Otherwise, the judge is going to say, what are you even doing here? And in fact, we know that 8 out of 10 evictions are for failure to pay rent. And that continues to be one of the reasons why you could evict someone, even if this policy were to pass. So that's on the eviction side. The bigger change is that every tenant would have automatic lease renewal. So right now you get to the end of a 1-year or 2-year lease. The landlord kind of gets to decide what terms they want to offer for a renewal. And they also get to determine if they want to offer it at all. Sometimes you might have someone who's not breaking the lease, who's not doing anything that you would cops on them for, but they're a nuisance in other ways. They're making other people uncomfortable. They're sitting on the stoop with something in a brown paper bag, and there are kids in the building, and the parents ask you as the landlord to do something about it. It's not anything you can do. Sometimes, someone who mutters to themselves or talks inappropriately or what have you. Sometimes it's someone who's just persistently 2-3 months late on their rent. And they pay it eventually. So you're not going to evict them for failure to pay rent, but it's a pain in the butt. And you might not want to deal with that person anymore. You have the option right now to say, like, you know what? I'm not going to renew your lease at the end of this. I'm giving you plenty of notice. Find something else. Godspeed. You wouldn't be able to do that. You could only offer a non-renewal for, again, those same categories that you could actually evict someone in the first place. So they would have to not have paid rent. They would have to be doing something illegal or causing damage or so on and so forth. That's a very big change. That means that essentially all of your tenants have a lease for life, unless they do something very far outside the bounds, or unless you can take them to court and prove it in a court of law that you can non-renew their lease at the end of it. Part number 3 is it narrows it down even further. So landlords would be limited on the amount that they could increase rent year by year. In the current draft of the bill, it's something absolutely absurd, like 1.5 times the rate of inflation or 3%, which is the lowest anywhere anyone has ever proposed any. But essentially what that would mean is if you said, let's say inflation, and let's say it's the 3%. And for whatever reason, you need to raise it 4%, 5% for repairs, because you notice you're undervaluing your property compared to others within your immediate neighborhood, so on and so forth. You're trying to ask for 5. The tenant cannot pay that because they would say that's above the threshold. And then you can evict them, but the onus is on you to prove that you actually need that rent increase. Meanwhile, you're going to housing court to prove it. That could take months. Months during which the tenant is not paying rent and you actually can't evict them. So it creates essentially a de facto rent cap. Now, different states do it differently. California is 5 plus the rate of inflation, or 10%. New Jersey does it completely differently, where the tenant can challenge the rent increase in court, but there's not a set number. So the tenant would have to be the one actively challenging. Here it's just automatic. It's above a certain threshold. Tenant doesn't actually have to pay it, and you can't really evict them unless you can prove in a court of law that you need that increase. That's very, very different, a completely different system than what we have. And then the last piece of it is they have various exemptions. And the New York bill that is currently being proposed has the fewest exemptions of anything that's been proposed so far. So in California, they exempt new construction for the first 10 to 15 years because we want to build more homes and be able to finance building more homes. We want banks to say, yes, I'm going to loan you this money to build this because I know you're going to make a return on investment on it and I will get paid back. So they exempt it for the first 10 to 15 years. There's no exemption for new construction in the bill that exists in New York State at all. And it applies to everything except for buildings that are 4 units or fewer if it's owner occupied. So that's your small landlord right there that's hitting directly.
Mhm.
Right. If you're not physically living in your building, you are not exempt. I have some landlords who live in a 20-unit building with their parents. They're not exempt because it's over 4. Even though it's owner occupied, they wouldn't be exempt from this either. Now, we keep hearing from our legislators that don't look at the bill as written. We'll do a compromise version of this. But the principles are just kind of the same no matter what. A landlord is not in charge, if this something like this were to pass, of deciding who they're going to rent to. Every tenant is prospectively a tenant for life. You can't take a flyer on somebody for a year or 2 and say, like, I want to give them a break, because if it doesn't work out, you're going to be very, very encumbered in terms of trying to find ways for that tenant not to get renewed or to leave unless they're actively violating the lease in a way that you can prove in a court of law. And then the last piece of it is a rent cap. So, both proponents and opponents of the bill that's been drafted call it universal rent control. Because at the end of the day, that's functionally what it is. If you can't go above that certain threshold, or it can be very, very, very difficult for you to collect your rent.
Right. I feel like from my perspective, just hearing that, one of the most important things that sticks in my mind, clearly the rent increase and how that's impacted. And fine, there are certain constraints and restrictions already in many states about how you can raise rent. But once again, really putting that much more strict already is something that I'm hearing. But then also saying that I can't control who is in my property or who is not in my property. To me, that creates a huge issue as a person that's supposed to be running my business. That's actually taking away the thought of my business and the control that I have as an owner. That's now really dictating who's going to be in my property, what that's going to look like, and how I'm really running my business, rather than leaving that onus to the actual owner. Why do people think this is a good idea?
Well, obviously, there are a lot of folks who are tenants And for them, it's a pretty good deal, right? No matter where you are in the income spectrum, if you're on the lower level or if you're somewhat middle class, or even if you're upper class, you would be covered by this, knowing that your rent is only going to increase a certain percentage, period, full stop. That makes you feel pretty good, I would think,
Yeah.
if you're able to plan financially moving forward. And also knowing that at the end of the day, as long as you're doing certain things, you're going to have a lease contract for as long as you want it. It's not bad, right? If you look at it from an average tenant's point of view, this sounds pretty good. But what they're not thinking about are what some of the unintended consequences of that will be. Because just as one example, if you're screening for prospective tenants, you're going to screen them differently if it's someone who you know you're only going to be there for a year and you'll try it out and you'll see how it goes. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. You're only bound by the terms of the contract than if someone is essentially going to be in your building for as long as they want, forever, essentially. You're going to
Right.
treat that differently. And what that's actually going to hurt is that is going to hurt those folks who are on the boat, who do need some type of like someone to take a flyer on them, someone to take a chance on them, give them a second chance. They've got some bad credit history. Maybe they've had some incidents in the past that they're trying to put behind them and have a fresh start. Those people are the ones who are actually going to be disadvantaged. And then the second group of people who are going to be disadvantaged are really going to be existing tenants. When you think about the folks who you can't really get out because you can't evict them in a court of law, they're creating a nuisance. What you really need is maybe some tenants in the building to testify that this person is disturbing us for the following reasons. That almost never happens. Most tenants will go to the landlord and say, "You're the landlord. It's your job. You got to fix it." And then when you say, "Well, can you come down to housing court between the hours of 1 and 5 on a random Wednesday?" They can't. They've got their job. They've got their kids and doing a bunch of other things. They also have to live with this tenant, so they don't want to put their neck out. That's very, very, very hard. At the end of the day, the landlord had the recourse of essentially saying, "Listen, his contract is up in 6 months. Her contract is up in 4 months. Just hang in there. We'll be okay." They won't have that option anymore. So
Right.
oftentimes we know that good tenants will flee a bad situation if they feel like the landlord can't deal with this. And this is something where for those relatively few problem cases, your options would be very limited.
I also feel like I'm seeing a possibility of more violations of fair housing also due to this. When talking about screening tenants, I absolutely understand then having less people wanting to take a chance on somebody that maybe missed a few payments in the past or had a previous eviction or had, once again, either complaints or missed payments, poor credit, maybe an unstable job history. I can see all of those things that already are creating a problem for some of those people to find secure housing. But now I'm almost thinking I can see where this is somebody saying, "Hey, this is a young couple. They don't have kids right now. They plan on starting a family. Now, this is all of a sudden, can this unit of mine sustain for, once again, the foreseeable future, now to have a growing family in that?" I can see, once again, those are things that we are violating fair housing laws. But
Yes.
now I can start to see people start to think that way and say, "Hey, actually, maybe I would rather just two friends rather than an actual family because, hey, these two single guys are eventually going to kind of move on and they'll end up leaving and then I can get my unit back." So I can start to see the other ways that now we're, as landlords, not only are we not willing to kind of take the chance and maybe our criteria is a little bit more strict when we're tenant screening, but really where there's a lot of these issues running into fair housing when, once again, we're not choosing the tenant that qualifies for the following year, but now really is the tenant that's going to qualify for the next 10, 15. I actually have a tenant that's been in a property clearly before I bought it, but they've been renting in that same apartment for 29 years. And they're probably gonna be there for another 10 or 15.
That's probably right.
So and that's something that now all of a sudden, if that screening would have looked very, very differently at that point in time, I'm sure, if the owner at the time, once again, they clearly sold, but if that owner said, "Hey, these are the people that are gonna be with me for 45 years," you're gonna, once again, that's like marriage. That's really thinking about being a little more wise in your partner for that time being, especially that small landlord, right? Most small landlords own 1 to 2 rentals. really then saying, this is something that I put all my savings into, that I put my investment into, that's my retirement plan. You're really putting that in somebody else's hands. Unfortunately, I think there's going to be a lot more cases of discrimination that can be caused from this as well.
Right. And again, we're obviously saying anyone who's listening to this, don't violate fair housing laws. That's not
Do
cool.
those
We
things.
can see why you would think that, but don't do it, even if something like this passes. But I think you're right. There are certainly going to be some vulnerable at risk tenants who will, in fact, have a harder time finding affordable housing if something like this were to pass. And then
Right.
the last piece of it on top of it is you've got a rent cap where all of a sudden there isn't a rent cap. So if something catastrophic happens and you've got like a triplex or something like that, but it needs a new roof, it needs a new boiler, so on and so forth, and you only have one or two properties, maybe just one, you're not sitting on enough cash to fix that yourself 9 times out of 10. You're going to need to
Right.
borrow. You're going to need to go to a bank or a non-financial lender to get the money to do those repairs. They're going to want to see how those finances work out over time. And one of the things that we saw, they just passed a whole raft of tenant protections and rent laws in 2019. Most of them affected rent stabilization. What we saw after 2019 was a lot of financial lenders here in New York basically said, I don't really know how this works. So you first. And they sort of all pushed it to Signature Bank and New York Community Bank. And then some of the bigger ones like Bank of America, where it was going to be a small slice of their loan portfolio, kept lending to rent stabilized properties. Well, we're now seeing those banks that kept on doing it for rent stabilized properties being really in a lot of trouble because it turns out that some of these finances don't work out and they're not necessarily making the return back on the investment or to fund the repairs that they're currently doing. So you saw Signature Bank close earlier this year. And the part of their loan book that nobody wanted to touch were these rent stabilized, rent constrained properties. They were called toxic assets. And they sort of got sent off to a nonprofit to sort of deal with because none of the big lenders wanted to touch it. Well, now all of a sudden transpose that onto the entire state. And I'm certainly not saying that all banks will say like, well, forget this. We're not doing any business in New York anymore. But some of them will say like, let's dial back on our lending and let someone else figure out how this works. And then once we're convinced we can make our money back, we'll go back into it. Well, that's fewer lending choices for the landlord. That's probably higher interest rates. The repairs are more expensive. And at a certain point, they'll get patched rather than actually being done correctly because that's all that the landlord can afford.
Thinking about extra costs, the other thing that I'm hearing within good cause eviction, not only do I have all these other constraints and I can't necessarily raise rents in accordance to even market rent in some situations with this, but you've mentioned me going to court a lot more often, right? That now not only is for the small time landlord, time away from work, time away from family, those types of things, but also involvement with attorneys, right? Or what other filings need to be done. I've even been through small claims in my time as a small landlord, and those are things that there are costs, not just the opportunity of missing out of other things I could have been doing to make money, like actually go to my day job, but those are things that also now are impacting me that I have to pay for those costs and bring lawyers involved. So now not being paid rent, not being paid market rent, then spending time in court with attorneys over months and months and months. This is not really sounding like this whole financial freedom that we really like to talk about within
Exactly.
landlords.
I have only have experience with the housing courts here in New York State. They are miserable. They are awful for tenants. I don't want to understate how awful they are for tenants to go through it, but they're also bad. They're no picnic for landlords either. One of my property owners says to me, if I'm going to housing court, I've already lost. It's just a question of how much more I'm going to lose. And that's
Right.
adjudicating. Here in Westchester County, an eviction proceeding, even where it's something straightforward like failure to pay rent, where it's cut and dry, the rent just didn't get paid, that can still take between 6 months and a year to work its way through a housing court. And then the average case in Westchester County of time before a judge is 3 minutes per case. So it's a lot of waiting, paying the lawyers, not getting paid for the rent. It's just not a very, very good system. They are understaffed, they are under resourced. And now all of a sudden, anything that's disputed in terms of the lease renewal also has to go to housing court. And if you want to raise the rent above whatever the threshold is, be it 3% or 5% or whatever they ultimately decide that they want to pass in this legislation, you have to go to court and prove that you need more than that. It's going to put even more burden on that system that is already terrible for it.
Right. To go to have a lease that has an end date on it, to have that be enforced, to have to go to a court to say, hey, the date on the contract is the date on the contract is absolutely going to have a huge influx of cases, which once again is just going to drag that out even longer. So what's interesting is we have a debate in Lady Landlords rather often about buying in states like New York, like California, that tend to be a little bit more on the tenant friendly side, right? Tim, you know that most of my properties are in New York. I absolutely love it. And I will still continue to buy in New York, even with this current conversation. But I'm sure a lot of our listeners are like, oh, that is it. Hell no, absolutely not buying in New York. But I want you to reiterate the point of this is not just a New York situation. Many other states that already have this, or also have already had this for years enacted, but now also is kind of on the docket in other states as well.
Well, and in some ways, New Jersey is a very good counterexample to this, right? They do have the automatic lease renewal, which they've lived with it with the generation. What they don't have is they don't have the hard rent cap. In that case, a tenant can challenge a rent increase as being unconscionable, but it's not defined within the law. There's no hard cap that applies to everybody, old house, new house, whatever. And so that system works very, very differently. And so the details do actually tend to matter on this. You don't need to be like a super policy nerd, as been accused of being from time to time. You just have to sort of understand how it's going to work for you. And that gets back to the point that we made right from the get-go. The antidote to bad policy is good conversation. And really, coming forward in good faith, talking to your local electeds quite a lot and showing them your finances, because this isn't their thing. They're not landlords themselves. They hear a lot from tenants, and oftentimes the tenants who are calling are in the most dire cases. Maybe they are actually dealing with a real bad landlord who's doing fair housing violations or hasn't fixed things. Or every time I open the paper and read a bad landlord story, I secretly cross my fingers until I can check my member database and make sure they're not one of our landlords, right? Because there are people out there who are bad. There are bad tenants too. And some of those stories can be very moving and persuasive as well. At the end of the day, what they need to do is they need to hear from you. They need to hear from you, no matter what state you're in, about the challenges that you're actually dealing with, what you're actually trying to do. Because for the most part, the folks listening to your podcast are not Blackstone, right? There's someone who is trying to do what has been a tried and true way of creating some type of financial support for their families, to help pay for college, to help pay for retirement, to give them some better freedoms in terms of the career opportunities. And at the end of the day, they're also supplying an essential service in terms of housing. And so when you start with that you're not big landlord who's coming to like terrorize people, but you're a person who lives in the community, who's invested in the community, that can go a long way.
Now, what type of person should I be reaching out? How far should I go in my community? Should I reach out to my local city council, my senator, my congressperson? What level should I reach out? And what's usually the best form to do that?
So this is different for every state. Here in New York and in a lot of states that are like New York, you should start with your state legislators. Here in New York, we've got a state assembly member, we've got a state senator for every district. And the reason for that is the laws that govern landlord-tenant relations are all at the state level. So they're going to pass something looking for it to apply to the entire state. They need to know what's happening in their own backyard. After that, it's probably worth talking to your mayor or your local council member, not because you're necessarily expecting them to pass one thing or another in terms of a city ordinance. Most city ordinances, and certainly town ordinances and village ordinances, rarely get into this area at all. But they should understand you as a local business owner, as someone who's invested in the community, maybe as someone who also lives in the community that they're trying to work in, what you're trying to do. So that if a problem arises, they're not just listening to, the talking points from advocacy organizations. They're not just looking to like bad press report, they can feel comfortable enough to talk to you and say, like, what are you actually going through? What does this look like? Is this reasonable? Is there a story behind the story? And those relationships can be very valuable, not just on your business, but also just in general in the community.
Right. For good cause eviction, and those of us that are facing this in New York, once again, that we are back around to this, are there things that we can specifically do with good cause eviction at this point in time?
So the single most important thing that we tell everybody is if you haven't talked to your assembly member or your state senator, call their office, maybe see if you can get an appointment. If you have an organization like BRI in your backyard, we would be more than happy to help facilitate those conversations and just let them know what you're concerned about if something like this passes and why. And I always say, you're not an expert on policy, but you are an expert on what you do every day. And they're not. And they need your expertise to understand what the actual effect is going to be. So call up, have that conversation. It's usually not useful to say, like, I can't believe all of you Albany bums are trying to stick it to me once again. But come from a place of like, I know you're looking at this. I can understand why. Let me tell you about what policy like this would do to me as someone who's a constituent of yours. Having conversations with constituents is what they're supposed to do. And if you're
Right.
acting in good faith, 9 times out of 10, you'll see that good faith return to you. They may not ultimately agree with you at the end of the day, but they'll have that conversation. And having that dialogue, again, you're either at the table or you're on the menu. They need to hear from you and how it's going to affect you.
Thank you. I think those are some fantastic tips about what we can do specifically for this issue, but also then start to get involved within future issues and really put ourselves once again as part of the solution, and also give us another way to be able to control and be a part of securing the investments that we are making as landlords. So Tim, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time in breaking down something that's very different that we don't talk about enough within landlording, especially on the residential side. So thank you very much for your time today. I will make sure to link BRI for any of those that are local to the Westchester Hudson Valley area to make sure that they can learn more about the organization. When I get back to New York, when I get back to the United States very soon, I'm going to be excited to come to some of the networking events that are coming up next month. So I look forward to seeing you, and hopefully some of our other lady landlords will start to come out to our meeting and then also be able to find local meetings and start to make a difference in their communities as well. So Tim, thank you very much for being here.
Absolutely. Can I give one more tip? So
Of course.
we actually have an online tool because good cause eviction is, at the time that we're recording this, is actually being discussed as part of the state budget right now. So if you go to our website, which is buildersinstitute.org/take action, you'll see one of those online widgets that allows you to just put your name and your address in, and it will figure out who to send your message to. It'll send it to the governor, your state assembly member, and your state senator. It takes about 30 seconds to do. If you don't have time to call the office, you don't have time to make an appointment, you have 30 seconds to send a quick email, and that can be impactful as well.
And that I'm also going to link down in the show notes. So that way our listeners can just go down, click on that button right where they're watching on YouTube or where they're listening to a podcast, and just be able to go and send that email automatically. So I'm going to make it as easy as possible to make sure that we can really do what's right and speak up as landlords on this action. So thank you. That's going to be fantastic. Well, Tim, thank you very much for being here today. To all of our listeners, thank you for also tuning into this episode of the Lady Landlords podcast. Do make sure to hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next episode of the Lady Landlords podcast. We release new episodes every single Tuesday. And also, please make sure to leave a 5-star review. This helps other women be able to find our channel and learn more about how they can also use real estate investing to reach financial freedom. Thank you much for being here, and we will see you all next Tuesday. Thank you for listening to the Lady Landlords podcast. If you're feeling stuck in your real estate investing journey, visit lady-landlords.com to book a 15-minute orientation call with me and see if you're ready to join our mentorship program. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter and join our Facebook group for exclusive real estate investing tips and offers. Invest with confidence. Become a Lady Landlord today.